We need to know today. That was it. All right. All right. Well, come about the first week of December, Kent sends me a text, says, "I want you to do 10 minutes on dating." And I thought, that's a horrible plan. I only dated one woman in my life. And it wasn't really dating. It was more like waiting for her to agree to marry me. So I've only been on one other official date, and I was in high school, and it did not go well. So, but anyways, he clarified later, and carbon dating. Well, I can do that, but I got to do that in 10 minutes? That seems kind of ridiculous. And I was sweating it the whole day, and then he said, well, we'll give you a whole hour. And then I was like, oh, wow, I can do that, but then you're going to want to hear something else too. So, anyways, he did kind of pump you up this morning and say we're going to talk about the statistical probability of Jesus fulfilling all the prophecies and stuff. We had to nits that. We didn't have time for that. So we're going to leave that off till next time, but you should have fun. Anyway, so we're going to talk about more on the religions of science or how carbon dating came to age the world. Okay? So I have created a nice little diagram to help you guys learn what carbon dating is. And let's see here. Does that work? It's not working. Oh. Hold on. Which way did I go? There we go. Ooh, see, that's the problem. Very touchy. That's going to be a problem. Okay, so like most problems that the Earth has, it starts with cosmic rays that come from the sun. Okay, and what happens is, see, this is going to be an issue. Those cosmic rays hit the Earth's atmosphere. Okay, and we have these helium atoms that roam around in the atmosphere, free-ranging helium atoms. Okay, these cosmic rays basically bombard the nuclei of the atom, which makes a newly homeless neutron floating around. Okay, that newly homeless neutron finds a lonely nitrogen, which creates an emancipated proton and a rather desperate carbon-14 atom. Okay, so carbon does not like to be alone at all. So what happens is it runs into some lonely oxygen. Okay, and that creates this radioactive carbon dioxide. Okay, so it's carbon-14 dioxide. Now, normally carbon dioxide is carbon-12. Okay, now the typical, basically, ratio of these is going to be 1 trillion of these for every one of these. Okay, so it's 1 trillion, 1,000 billion, there's a bunch. Okay, there's not too much of this stuff going on. Now what happens is we have trees on the planet, right? And what do trees do? Trees breathe in carbon dioxide, right? We remember from our high school math science classes. Okay, so what happens is what's called carbon fixation. Okay, the trees basically breathe the carbon in. They go through photosynthesis and stuff. They strip off the oxygen, they output it so that we can breathe and have life, because the Lord's plan is very good. And then they fix that carbon into their tissues. Okay, and then let's see, and so it also goes into like the grass and stuff that's around in the environment, the bushes, basically everything that is an organic plant matter takes it up. Okay, and then we're also on Earth, so we have water. That water, due to gas solubility, takes up the carbon-14 dioxide too, okay? Which then you have all the plants in the water, so the algae and the seaweed and all that jazz takes it up. And we have crops like wheat and things like that, grains, that all take it up too. Now, what happens is along comes, say, a cow, okay? That cow eats some grass, okay? That grass brings the carbon-14 into him. Now, we also have a chicken, which eats the worms and jazz and the grass and stuff, and it uptakes it as well. Then you have fish in the ocean that eat some of the algae and the seaweed and stuff. Then you have slightly bigger fish that eat that fish, and another bigger fish that comes on and eats that fish. Okay, so the carbon basically moves down through the food chain. Now, because you got all these cows and chickens and stuff, you got to have a farm. You got a farm, you're going to have a farmer. Okay, so that farmer, he eats some of the grain. Okay, so he's uptaking the carbon that way. And then he milks the cow, and he drinks the milk, takes that, and the farmer gets desperate, and he eats the chicken. Okay, so he's taking that to the meat too. Okay, now because he ate his chicken, he really likes meat, so he eats a cow. Okay, so then he takes it through that. So it moves all down through the food chain. Okay, now because he ate his cow and a chicken, and he needs more food, he sends his sister out to fish. Okay, his sister fishing brings the carbon from the ocean into the living organisms as well. Okay, now Winter comes, they get cold, they cut down the trees, okay, kill the trees. And then they killed the chicken, so there's your dead chicken, okay. They killed your cow, so there's your dead cow. And because it's winter, and they killed their cow and their chicken, and the ocean froze over, they died, okay. So, this is what we call in technical terms life cessation, okay, because scientists tend to like to have big names for stuff. So life cessation is death, okay, which occurs, then this carbon fixation stops, okay, so they're no longer taking the carbon-14 in and the carbon-12 in from the atmosphere, so that when that stops, then we can have fun with things like carbon dating. Now let's talk about half-life first, okay. Say we have a big lump of carbon-14, okay, a pound of it. The half-life of carbon-14 is 5,730 years, okay. What that means is 5,730 years later, you will have half a lump of carbon-14, okay, or half a pound. That's all half-life is, okay. It's nothing too complicated. Yep. Okay, so here's the basic process. If you find something that is organic in origin and you want to date it with carbon dating, use the following procedure. You send it to a certified carbon dating lab. Now your question will first be, what makes a certified carbon dating lab? They say they're good at it, okay? That's how it works. They measure the amount of carbon-14 versus carbon-12 with a mass spectrometer, an expensive piece of equipment basically. And then using an assumed fixed ratio of 1 carbon-14 to a trillion carbon-12s, they work out how much carbon-14 is missing, okay? Once you know how much is missing, well, see. Sorry, I'm having using the wheel on the mouse and it's causing trouble. So once you know how much is missing versus what you have, you can use the known half-life to work out how old the object is. So, very delicately, we'll move that forward. See, now I want to go. Oh, is the problem my pointer off the screen? Well, where is it? If it was on the screen, I could probably use it better. Okay. The problem was it wouldn't work. So, now it'll work since the pointer's on the screen. Thank you. So, some of the problems, okay? Even the best equipment that we have, okay, we can't detect carbon-14 past about 7 or 9 half-life cycles, okay, because it keeps reducing and reducing and reducing down, and our equipment's only so good. 7 cycles is about 40,000 years at the best situation, okay, if everything was perfect. Is extremely difficult to validate the results from carbon dating, okay, and the only way we can really do so is with comparison with the objects that are known to be of a certain age, okay. So, can you think of something that is very easy to know by the age of observation? It's not a rhetorical question you're allowed to answer now. Trees, good job, okay, so trees. So, how about some tree rings, okay? And this is actually the best way we have to do it, okay? So, does anybody know what this is? It is a tree. Can anybody be slightly more specific? It is the oldest living thing currently on the planet, okay? This is a bristle cone pine tree. Its name is Methuselah, okay? I love how they named it after a biblical character. It's fantastic, okay? So it's the oldest single living organism on the earth today, and it's this bristle cone pine tree named Methuselah. It was counted to be 4,844 years old, okay? Does anybody know the name of what is known to have been the oldest thing to have ever lived? It's another bristlecone pine tree called Prometheus, okay? This is Prometheus today, okay? What happened is the government sent this rather bright scientist out to count how old these trees were. So he took a French tool and he bored a hole in the side of the tree, and his tool broke. Now, being the bright scientist that he was, and he had to count this tree, he went and found a lumberjack and cut the tree down, okay, because he's a bright guy, okay. Now, when we did this, okay, we found that he didn't know the tree was this old. Nobody had any idea that these trees were anywhere near this old, so that's in his favor. But named Prometheus, it's been counted to be 4,950 years old, okay, so it's old. Now, and that was in 1964 when he cut it down. This is what we have of Prometheus. It's a chunk here, this line right here. That's where he broke his tool off. So he cut the whole tree down to get that out. So the problem that we have with the tree rings, if you've looked at old trees or old wood, the rings toward the center compress. So the older the tree is, the thinner the rings get towards the middle, and the middle ones are the older one, the younger ones are the outer one, okay? What happens is when you get a tree that's 4,950 years old, the rings toward the center are so close together that they physically can't count them, okay? They popped it underneath an electron microscope and everything. They physically can't really tell the difference. So what they do, they decided to carbon date it, and they used differential carbon dating through the rings to count how many rings there were. And then they used that to validate their carbon dating. A rather interesting concept. You don't usually use one method to justify itself. It's a rather strange nature of things. So now we just relax and we look at a peekaboo kitty. Okay. This is what I wish the carbon dating scientists were looking at instead of tree rings. Okay. And what they do is, oh, see, now we're down here with this thing. Boom. Okay. So we're done with that page. And we're done with that page. So they use these tree rings to create these rather boring graphs, okay, that they use. And then what they've done is they've dug up old trees, okay, and they carbon dated the rings in that tree, and they use that to line that tree ring up with some tree rings from Prometheus so that they can count further back. So again, they're using their dating to create their scale for their dating. And the scale is used to modify the ranges of the ages and stuff. So it's a self-fixing thing according to them. Some interesting problems here, one of which, does the rate of carbon-14 in the atmosphere remain constant? This is one of the big deals because they tell us there's a constant ratio of one of these to a trillion of these, okay? In order for that to be constant, that would mean that the rate of removal or the rate of decay of carbon-14 was equal to its rate of production. However, the problem is that it's not. If you assume that the initial atmosphere had no carbon-14 in the atmosphere, it should take about 30,000 years for it to reach equilibrium. And we can measure today that the rate of production is about 18.8 atoms per gram of total carbon in the world. And the rate of decay is actually 16.1. Now what you need to know is that the rate of production is greater than the rate of decay, which means that since we're not dumping as much as we're making, that we have not reached that point, that initial point of equilibrium yet, which means that, and since the production is significantly higher, it would suggest that the Earth is not actually all that old. Okay? Things affecting carbon-14 in the atmosphere. Okay, we have this Earth's atmosphere here that's affecting this cosmic rays, and since this is what's generating our homeless neutrons, things that affect that would be like the magnetic field of the Earth. Okay, so we have this magnetic field, and it protects us from that harmful radiation. It can be measured to this really brilliant guy named Gauss back in the 1850s-ish, and it can be measured that it's been found to get weaker over time, okay? And when the magnetic field was higher, less radiation would have entered the atmosphere, and thus less carbon-14 would have been produced. The interesting part about that is today, the field is 10% weaker than it was when Gauss originally measured it in 1845, okay? The interesting thing about that is that given the rate of degradation that we're seeing, it would indicate that the magnetic field's about 10,000 years old, which is kind of cool, okay? Now, when a scientist reads that, he goes, well, it regenerates itself. Why, we don't know, but it works. So, anywho, sometimes I wish we'd take scientists and we'd strap 10-year-old kids to their back, and they had to speak everything they thought out loud, and the 10-year-old would say, what? Doesn't make any sense. It's also been discovered that the rate of production is dependent upon your geographic location. Okay, it turns out that we're making carbon-14 a lot faster at the equator than we are at the poles. Okay, can anybody think of why? Exactly. These cosmic rays hit say the magnetic field. If you're at the equator, you're going directly through. If you're at the pole, you get things like the aurora borealis and stuff like that. Whereas actually that's ionizing the atmosphere, but it's bouncing off, so it has a lot less effect. What's interesting about that is they tend to do a lot of carbon dating on ice and stuff that's in the poles. And since there's a lot less, but they're using the same ratio that they get from here up at their pole. So why? Who knows? It's a good question. Now remember, it's also one of these to a trillion of these. So what happens if there's 2 of these to a trillion of these? You've doubled your number. Holy smokes, that's a big difference. It doesn't take much when you're talking about 1 in a trillion to make a huge difference. So even if it's half, if there's half of these to a trillion of those, you got a big problem. Your number is now millions of years off just because of a 1 little digit there. So what would that be? All right, we did a lot of interesting tests during the 40s and 50s, right? Okay. Nuclear bombs have a lot of radiation, okay? They really dump a lot of radiation into the atmosphere, which creates a lot of issues with ionizing carbon-14 and things like that, which throws off their ratios a lot. Now, these are things that we've seen in the last 100 years that are significantly affecting their ratio. Does anybody know what this is? That's right, that's a volcano. This particular one's in Greenland. Really cool. Volcanoes have a massive effect on geologic timescale in a lot of ways, but this particular one we're talking about carbon-13, so they release a ton of carbon in the atmosphere, okay? They also release a lot of gases and stuff that affect the ionization process, but they're so big, these are them from space, okay? So this is actually that same volcano from space right there at the point, I think that was like 4 or 5 hours after it erupted. So it's making a big difference. And it has a large impact on local creation of carbon-14, but also on a global scale. Okay, so those are all things that are tweaking with their probabilities. The other thing is we have our cows and our chickens eating our carbon. Do organisms fixate carbon-14 at the same way that they fixate carbon-12? That would be a big difference because that would affect everything. Okay, what's interesting, if you go to Hawaii, and you pick up a snail and you pop the snail out and you carbon date its shell, it turns out that it carbon dates to be over 2,000 years old. Now, the snails only live about 12 years. And when you ask them, well, why does it measure to be 2,000 years old? They go, we don't know. Okay, but hey, it still works. So let's move on from there. Okay. Some other things that we know that affects it. For instance, maybe the flood, okay? The flood, what happens when you flood the entire earth is you remove a lot of carbon, okay? All that vegetation and stuff gets churned over, and what that does, that removes all the living organisms basically creating today's fossil fuel supply, okay? Interesting note about the fossil fuels is that if you look at the level of fossil fuels in the world today, that indicates that there's about 500 times more living organisms prior to the flood than there are now, which would not only dilute the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, it blows it off the map, okay? Which would indicate that everything that's measured in age that we believe to have lived pre-flood, if you measure it now, it's going to turn out to be a lot older than it actually is. It's going to test to be a lot older than it really is. Which is what we see. So that's a number one problem there. Boom, boom, boom. Next page. So inherently, the problem is that the preconceived notions of age bias the results. Okay. What happens when a lab gets something that it thinks is young, it measures it and it comes out young, they say, yay, it's young. If they think it's old and they measure it and it comes out young, they go, there must have been contamination. That's a problem. We're going to throw that out. Okay. Does anybody know what this is? Coal. Exactly right. Okay. Now, coal is believed to be produced by a significant amount of pressure and heat and timed, and according to scientists, must be millions of years old. Okay. Does it just takes that long to make it? Does anybody know what this is? It's an uncut diamond, that's right. Okay, and the uncut diamonds are even older, right? Because they take the coal and a lot more heat and a lot more pressure and a lot more time, and you get diamonds. So they must be hundreds of millions of years old. And they're evidently really deep down and very hard to get, and it must be a very dirty process, which means since it's far down in the earth, it must be really, really old. Okay, so how old is it? If you take something that's really, really old, and how much carbon-14 would you expect to have in it when you check it? None. Okay, basically the half-life would reduce it, especially if it's past that 7 to 9 half-life cycles. It reduce it to the point that you couldn't measure it. So effectively, it would be carbon-14 dead, is what they call it. Okay, that's why they don't measure stuff that they think is too old, because obviously there won't be anything in it. Okay, the interesting thing is that what happened was the scientists took 10 samples that they got from the government of coal, and they sent 10 samples to a carbon dating lab, and they had them date them. Okay. The interesting thing is that they all found carbon-14 in them, and they measured to be about 47,000 years old, which is definitely not hundreds of millions of years. Okay, they actually found that the level is about 0.25% of current atmospheric levels, which is about 7.5 life cycles. Okay, and that was in all 10 samples. All 10 samples measured exactly the same, and they declared it to be contamination, and because they have to be far older than that. Okay, so once again, the 10-year-old goes, "What?" Okay, they may know what this is. Fossils. Okay, fossils of dinosaur. They may know which dinosaur. Who's the real nerd? Ah, see, we're getting there. It's an allosaur. Okay, actually, one of the most common fossils we have are allosaurs. The interesting thing with the allosaur is what happened is this guy named Hugh Miller, who's a Christian. He actually owns some allosaur bones. Okay, and he took a bone and he broke it. And because if you send them a dinosaur bone, they go, "Hey, it's a dinosaur bone. It's too old. We're not going to date it." So he broke it and told them it's an unknown bone. He sent them 2 samples, and they looked sort of like this, okay, old bone. And they took and they asked, "Well, how old is it?" It measured to be 10,000 to 16,000 years old, both samples. Okay, now I don't know about you, but that's slightly different than their preconceived notion that they're 60 million years old. The issue here is not that we're saying it's not 60 million years old, because that falls into the old Earth, new Earth argument, which is a valid argument, and there's some really interesting pros and cons of that. And I firmly believe that Christians can fall on both sides of the new world and old world. The interesting thing is that they believe that this is the way it has to be, okay, versus what they actually get out of it. So they're building their whole philosophy of the way that the universe was built on stuff that is not necessarily true. And everything that they know tells them it's probably not true, yet they still believe it. An interesting policy. Now, there's an interesting quote here from Dr. Robert Lee back in 1981. He talks about carbon dating, a very famous carbon dating scientist. He says, "The troubles of radiocarbon dating method are undeniable and deep and serious. Despite 35 years of technological refinement and better understanding, the underlying assumptions have been strongly challenged, and warnings are out that radiocarbon may soon find itself in a crisis situation. Continuing use of the method depends on a fix-it-as-we-go approach, allowing for contamination here, fractionation there, and calibration whenever possible. It should be no surprise then that fully half the dates are rejected. The wonder is surely that the remaining half has come to be accepted. No matter how useful it is, though the radiocarbon method is still not capable of yielding accurate and reliable results. The gross discrepancies, the chronology is uneven and relative, and the accepted dates are actually those that are just selected." Okay? And that was from a carbon dating scientist himself, who obviously thinks that their science is a bunch of hogwash. So, what we have to think of here is when the world believes one thing and the Bible teaches another, it's very tempting to think that God got the details wrong. And how often have we found God to be wrong so far? None. Okay, you're allowed to be very vocal about that. None. Okay, we haven't proven him wrong yet. So I tend to fall on his cycle there. So now, relax here for a minute. Maybe I think this is hilarious, actually. I can sit there and watch this for hours. It calms me. So, okay, let's talk about even more on the religions of science, or getting from the do to you via the zoo. Okay, we're going to talk about micro and macro evolution. Okay, so first let's define what evolution is. Okay, it is the change in the gene pool of a population from generation to generation by such processes as mutation, natural selection, and genetic drift, which affects fitness. Okay, one of the most important words here is actually fitness. That is the big deal. Fitness is the ability for an organism to pass its genes to the next generation. Okay, your fitness level is a measurement of how well you can procreate. Okay, if you can't produce babies, you can't pass on your genes. Okay, which means evolution does nothing. Okay, that's the big deal there. In the World English Dictionary and biology, they define it as a gradual change in the characteristics of a population of animals or plants over successive generations. Accounts for the origin of existing species from ancestors unlike them. Okay, interesting little caveat there. So let's look at, since they see also natural selection, I went to natural selection. Okay, the process by which forms of life having traits that better enable them to adapt to specific environmental pressures, such as predators, changes in the climate, or competition for food or mates, will tend to survive and reproduce in greater numbers than others of their kind, thus ensuring the perpetuation of those favorable traits in succeeding generations. Okay, this is what Darwin actually said. All right, this is real. Natural selection is a very real system. We see it all the time. Okay, cute girls don't usually go for really fat guys. Okay, and really fat guys don't always live all that long. So that would be a process of natural selection. Okay, and likewise we see that in the wild. So we'll move on from there. A few key points before we move on to micro and macro. Okay, the most important thing is to know that evolution is a blind process. Okay, there is no designer in it. Okay, just because a trait would be handy, okay, to have, or it would aid in the survival, does not have anything to do with the appearance of a mutation in the gene pool. Okay, because rats wanted to fly doesn't mean they become bats. Okay, that's basically what that means. It's not a, boy, I wish I could fly, and then 1,000 generations later you can fly. That's not how it works. It's a random process, and the random mutation has to be advantageous enough that it leads to an increase in fitness, and that increase in fitness allows you to pass that new mutation on to the subsequent people. Okay. Only those mutations that can be transmitted to the next generation without successive penalty to fitness are viable. Okay, those are nice big words that basically mean that, like I said, if you can't pass it to your babies, it's not a viable mutation. This is particularly interesting because that means the mutation cannot basically be one that is effective anywhere else in the body. Okay, the mutation has to occur within the egg or the sperm for sexually reproducing animals. Okay, it can't just be like a mutation in, Nick's brain. Okay, that makes him really smart and glow in the dark. Okay, if he can't pass it on to his babies, it's not a viable gene for any purpose whatsoever. Okay, the other thing that we need to know about is Occam's razor. Okay, who knows Occam's razor? He's a wonderful tool of science. Okay. Basically states that among competing hypotheses, the hypothesis with the fewest assumptions should be the selected hypothesis. This is not a law, it's just a good rule of thumb. Okay? Basically what it means is the simplest solution is probably the correct solution. Okay? Scientists use this all the time to basically keep their wild ideas in check. Somewhere along the line somebody forgot about it. So, but anyways, they taught it to me in college, but I think the professor wasn't paying attention to his own notes or something. So a brief discussion on systematics. Who's know what systematics is? Come on, you should know what systematics is. Okay, systematics is basically how we organize living creatures into their groups, okay? Typically you'll see, this is going to be some nice 7th grade science here. So K, P, C, O, F, G, and S leads my favorite mnemonic, which is Keen's play chess on fat girls' stomachs, okay? So the K is for kingdom, the P is for phylum, the C is for class, the order, you laugh, I've remembered this for 20 years just because of that, okay? The O is for order, the F is for family, the G is for genus, and the S is for species, okay? An example might be a kingdom of Animalia, a phylum of Chordata, the class of Mammalia, the order of Carnivora, the family of Ursidae, the genus of Ursus, and the species of Arctos. Yes, which bear? No. Now, you normally list it by genus species, so you'll see Ursus arctos, nice Latin words, okay? This is actually a common brown bear, okay? Now, you can have subspecies like the Ursus arctos horribilis. Does anybody know what the Ursus arctos horribilis is? Grizzly bear, good job. You're the man. So, let's talk about microevolution. It's the evolutionary change involving the gradual accumulation of mutations, positively affecting fitness, leading to new varieties within a species, observed over a short period of time. And this can lead to speciation, okay? So, this right here, you've all heard of Darwin's finches, right? It's one that we watched that video a couple weeks ago. They talk a lot about Darwin's finches. These are Darwin's finches, okay? Basically, he went to the Galapagos, and the Galapagos is made up of a bunch of crazy islands, okay? But they're fairly well isolated from each other. And basically, the idea was that one population of finches arrived in the Galapagos, got separated by storms and stuff, and finches can't fly too terribly far, so they're not able to, basically, the populations don't ever meet again, and they never get together and have fun and make babies. So what comes down is that the different environments have different types of food, different seeds, cactuses versus fruit and things like that, which can lead to different generations of beak bills, okay? So what happens is at one point in time there'll be a mutation that one bird has a longer bill than another bird, but he can eat better, so his fitness is higher, and he can reproduce better, okay, which allows that to basically move down the chain until all of his kids have longer beaks, and so on and so forth. It's called selective pressure, okay? We can see this type of stuff today, okay? I was taught by a scientist at UCR that was actually considered to be the guy that found the proof of modern microevolution, and he did it in a series of pools in Africa. Really fascinating study. But what happens is speciation is when this difference of the beak and stuff eventually gets to the point where if those populations do meet, they cannot basically mate, okay? The basic definition of a species is defined by whether or not you can mate with another member of the same species, okay? If you can't make viable offspring, you're not in the same species. Basic idea. Okay, so that's what's called speciation. We've seen it happen. It can be easy stuff, like all of a sudden the birds, they change what times of the year they reproduce and stuff like that. Or they change their color of their feathers, and now the girls from the one population don't like the boys from the other population and stuff like that. So it really can be pretty simple stuff. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. What's interesting about this, which actually have discovered that all of these beak length differences are because of one protein. The more protein that occurs in the embryo, the longer the beak is. And the less of it is, the shorter it is. So it's actually all controlled pretty much by one protein cycle, which is especially interesting since the Lord made it that way. It's like a knob. He turns it one direction, then they get longer. He turns it the other way, they get shorter. All right. If I was building it, that's how I'd do it. So, it's also things like, whether or not you can hide. So we got a moth here that's hiding on a tree. The one thing that might affect your fitness is whether or not you have a mutation that creates better camouflage, okay? If you have better camouflage, you don't get eaten. If you don't get eaten, you can probably procreate, okay? That's a big difference. So, let's move on to the wonderful concept of macroevolution, okay? They believe that major evolutionary transition from one type of organism to another occurring at the level of the genus and higher taxa, okay? This is basically the goo to you via the zoo argument, okay? So what happens is, this is a wonderful poster that's it's only in German. I can only find it in German. But I don't know why it's not in English anywhere. But it's the best example of what it is. But basically, it's the whole, we had the Earth formation and the tidal pools and protein soup and all that jazz got together and created functional organisms that differentiated into all these different ideas. And then what I like about this is it comes up here to salamanders, to triceratops, to goats, to chickens, to Adam and Eve, and she's actually holding an apple. I'm really not sure what bright guy came up with this thing. It's a crazy sense of humor, I tell you what. To summarize micro and macro, okay, so we got our taxa, right? Microevolution occurs on the species level only, okay? Like the guy said in the video, the finches stay finches, okay? The fish stay fish, the snail stay snail. You don't get crazy stuff going on. It deals with changes on a small scale, which can eventually lead to speciation in some circumstances, i.e. different types of dogs, okay? You can consider some dogs different species inherently because it's hard to make Chihuahuas with Great Danes, okay? It doesn't work out well. That would be something that would be considered a separate species. You can get macroevolution, though, applies to all the other levels on the tree, okay? It changes on a massive scale, leading to a different types of animals altogether, okay, i.e. fish turning into dogs, okay? That would be macroevolution. So, let's talk about a few of the problems, okay? One of the greatest problems is the sheer lack of evidence of modern animals evolved from a distantly different ancestor over the course of millions of years. We should be able to see it in the fossil record, okay? There should be at least thousands, if not millions, of examples of fossils documenting the gradual evolution from one physical state to another. The truth, however, is that the fossil record fails to support the notion of evolutionary gradualism in any way, shape, or form, okay? The fact is that most species exhibit no change during their tenure upon the Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear, okay? Now, what's interesting about this particular statement is this was made by possibly one of the most famous archaeologists of all time, a Harvard PhD paleontologist by the name of Stephen Jay Gould, wrote thousands of papers and tons of books. He's the go-to guy in paleontology. He said, I don't understand it, is basically what he said, but he's an evolutionist. Man. See, he forgot his Occam's razor too. Another fact that he said, species suddenly appear. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed. And he's still an evolutionist. Okay. Now, some people tend to call these people Darwinists. I personally don't like the term Darwinist because I think Darwin gets a bad rap. Darwin had an idea and he put it on paper. There's nothing wrong with putting an idea on paper. Okay. He didn't say that God didn't make it. He just said he couldn't understand his understanding of how God made the universe versus what he saw. There's nothing wrong with that. He raised a few questions. Okay. My problem is these people are actually evolutionists because they believe evolution created the universe as we know it today, and Darwin did not necessarily believe that at all. Okay, he just had an idea. So, some things there. Dr. Colin Patterson, who was a senior paleontologist at the British Natural History Museum, is an evolutionist, a fossil expert. He wrote a very significant book on evolution. Someone asked him why he did not show in his book any of the in-between or transitional forms when he wrote the book. And he answered back in the following manner. He said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest that an artist should be able to and used to visualize such transformations. But where would he get the information from? I could not honestly provide it. And if I were to leave it into an artistic license, would it not mislead the reader? I wrote the text of my book 4 years ago, and if I were to write it now, I think the book would be rather different. Gradualism is a concept I believe in, and not just because of Darwin's authority, okay, which how he gets authority in that I don't know, but because my understanding of genetics seems to demand it. Yet, as the famous expert Stephen Jay Gould said, and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. As a paleontologist myself, I am very much occupied with the philosophical problems of identifying ancestral forms in the fossil record. And you say that I should at least show a photo of the fossil for which each type of organism was derived. And I will lay it on the line. There is no such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. To me, he basically says I'm full of hogwash. Don't listen to me, but I don't know. Yeah. And there was an interesting counter argument I read because somebody got real angry that creationists used that argument against the guy, because that guy is actually very famous for saying stupid stuff in a room with creationists. Okay. He really does say things like the fossil record is total hogwash and stuff like that with creationists in the room, and everybody goes, and then he comes back and says, well, I didn't mean it. I was talking to scientists about a very specific problem. But he really does have some interesting things to say. If you ever get a chance, look him up. But anyways, another huge problem is an issue called irreducible complexity. Okay, an irreducibly complex system is composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. That sounds nice and complicated, doesn't it? Okay. Let's take, for instance, the internal combustion engine in your car, okay? If you change the size of the piston, okay, you have to change the camshaft, the rings, the block, the valves, the cooling system, the fuel system, et cetera, for the new engine to actually function, okay? If you take the pistons out, you don't go very far, okay? That's basically the idea behind irreducible complexity. Darwin wrote in 1859, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Okay, we have to give him the benefit that he's talking in 1859. They didn't know a whole lot about how animals worked and stuff in 1859, much compared to the information that we have today. What would this be? Chromosomes, okay. This is one of my favorite pictures of all time. Does anybody know what this is? This is visual proof of a double helix. Okay, Watson and Crick would have gone crazy to see this picture. Okay, so that's God's fingerprint right there, buddy. It doesn't get any better than that. So we have our double helix structure. Okay, a bunch of chromosomes. These are actually compressed DNA. Okay. And then you have this whole engine that's used to reproduce it and everything, horribly complex. Things that we have no concept of how it actually comes together and works. We just know that it does. Right down to the physical way that the individual atoms in DNA interact controls everything. And it's interesting too. So the molecular and protein interactions of DNA are so incredibly complicated that the accuracy and self-regulation of the DNA-based cellular engine alone are far superior to anything that mankind has ever dreamed of, much less actually built. Okay. For instance, DNA here, okay, is in its compressed form. It sits in the nucleus of the cell uncompressed. It looks like a bowl of spaghetti, basically, is a good way to describe it. Did you know that if you place each strand of DNA end to end, it comes to about 6 feet long in one cell? Okay, so take all the DNA out of a cell, stretch it end to end, it's about 6 feet long. Interesting thing about that is you have about 5 trillion cells in the average human body. Okay, some of us do have a few more cells than others. Okay, the present company not included. Okay, all DNA put together. Okay, if you put all the DNA in a human body together, that comes out to about 300 trillion feet. Okay, that's a big number. To help you understand how big that number is, the distance comes to about 56.8 trillion miles. Okay, the distance from here to the sun, does anybody know how far that is? Very close, actually 93 on average, but it can be more than 96 even at some points in time. So I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. So distance to the sun is 93 million miles. That means that if you take the DNA in one human being, put it end to end, it'll stretch from here to the sun and back 305,000 times. Okay? And that's how much DNA is in you. Okay? Much less the fact that we got, 7.4 billion people on the planet. Okay? You could probably take all the DNA, put it end to end, and wrap the entire Earth in it 20 feet deep, no problem. Okay? And we're walking around with it all day long. Okay? So, that's how big of a number it is. In the human genome, the DNA works by base pairs. It has the A to T and the C to G, thiamine, adenine, cytosine, and guanine. Okay, your pyrimidines and your purines. That basically, these forms what are called base pairs. Okay, the human genome has basically 3,234,830,000 base pairs. Okay, that's a lot. For instance, there's 2,700 languages on the planet Earth right now, about. Okay, the 2,700-ish. Okay, do you agree with that, Mark? Okay. The English is actually considered to have basically the most words because we'll take words from anybody's language and include it in ours. It's a given that we have about 1 million words in the English language right now. Okay. Interesting enough, we create a new word about every 98 minutes. Most languages have about 150,000. For instance, French has about 100,000 words. German has about 155,000 words. The closest to us is probably the Chinese, which gets a little complicated, but they figure they have about 850,000 unique words. If you take all the words in all the languages on the planet and add them together, it still falls short of how many base pairs are in your DNA. Okay, by a lot. Okay, so there is more language going on in each cell than there is on the face of the planet. Period. Okay, and that all just sprung into existence. No problem. Okay. Whew. I'm glad they figured that out. Okay. Now, let's move on to another issue of irreducible complexity. Okay, we have the human eye, which is a fascinating structure. Let's take a closer look at just the front of the eye. This is the anatomy of the front of the eye. Okay, one of my favorite structures is this one right here. It's called the canal of Schlemm. Does anybody know what the canal of Schlemm does? It controls the pressures of the fluid inside the eyeball. If the canal of Schlemm gets plugged up and is not working correctly, and you get to the point that your eyeball pops out of your head. That's why the canal of Schlemm is pretty cool. Okay. Yeah. So now you know what I think about it at night. Wrong button. Okay. So not only do we have the front of the eye, we have the retina. Okay, which is basically what's responsible for taking the light and transferring it into an electrical pulse that the brain understands. So the retina takes and sends it back to the brain. Okay, and then you have the brain structure that takes all that information and breaks it down into things like motion, okay, outline, depth and shades and colors, okay, which are all controlled by different parts of the brain. Now, actually let's back up here one second. The evolutionists often claim that the primate eye is the most evolved eye on the planet, okay? But many have mislabeled primitive eyes, okay, which have distinct advantages over ours. For example, the human eyeball can register about 60 frames per second, okay? So 60 pictures per second. Bees can process at about 300 frames per second, way more than we can, okay? For instance, movies are made in 24 frames per second, okay? So to us, the brain actually weaves all those still pictures together and creates fluid motion. To a bee, it's like flipping through a photo book, okay? It's just so slow. That's why it's hard to swat flies, by the way, okay? Because to them, you're just barely moving, okay? We're like, oh, yeah. Okay. So it gives the illusion of motion. The design innovation in so-called primitive animals is so much more complex than the corresponding structures in our eyes, okay? Yet we're the top of the food chain, evidently. A guy by the name of D.C. Dennett, who was a prominent evolutionist, in a paper entitled The Hoax of Intelligent Design and How It Was Perpetrated, very interesting little article, wrote that the eye lens is exquisitely well designed to do its job. These are his words. Exquisitely well designed to do its job, and the engineering rationale for the details is unmistakable, but no designer ever articulated it. He concludes that the complexity of its design is not real, but an illusion. He uses the term illusion, okay? It's magic. Because evolution explains the eye without the need for a designer. Now what's interesting is in his paper, he stops there. He doesn't go on to explain anything. He just says it's done. Okay, we don't need to talk about this anymore. When a scientist tells you that it's no longer an argument, it's done, that means they've run out of arguments, they have no clue what they're doing, and they've chosen to move on regardless, okay? Those are usually the times when you should pay attention. We did talk about the DNA. What's interesting, there's about 80,000 functional genes in the human genome, 7,500 of which are involved in the regulation of the retina alone. So that's, where did I go? This part here, okay? 7,500 genes are responsible for that. That's more than 10% of our DNA, okay? That's a lot, okay? This didn't just go poof, there it is, okay? It's not like one gene said, oh, there's an eyeball, okay? It's an entire process, and that's just the retina. It doesn't even include what it takes to physically make the eyeball itself, or the separate processing of the brain. It's actually believed now that the issue is not how the eye evolved, but how we came to process the information that the eye puts out. That's infinitely more complicated than just the eyeball itself. And the interesting part of that is they believe how many different types of eyes are there. This is actually what's called the A through L chart. It's the 12 basic types of eyes on the planet that we've discovered. There's 12 distinct different types grouped into 3 completely different methods of operation. In order for evolution to be true, these would have all had to have evolved separately. The 3 major types themselves, you would have had to have coordinated evolution of all 3 types independently. So this requires not only one vastly amazing miracle, but 3, okay, at one time, just to even get off the ground. That's how crazy it is. Oh, well, my cat jumping out of the box didn't work out too well that time. Yeah. Oh yeah. So not only do you have eyes, we have ears. Okay, we've got our tongue, which is an amazingly complicated device. Okay, you've got the human immune system. Okay, which basically uses the entire body. Okay, you've got things like your lymph nodes, your thymus, your spleen, all the long bones in the body, and then you have individual cells that are part of that, which are involved in your immune system. And on top of that, there's actually this crazy communication system between all the different leukocytes and everything of the immune system called interleukins. And there's 36 interleukins, and they actually hold conversations between the cells. They talk to each other about what to do and what they're doing. They coordinate their efforts. And if you believe in gradualism or evolutionism, then that all just kind of sprung into existence. It's like some sort of old school telephone. that just kind of evolved. Okay, so here we are now. Where'd I go? Where's my mouse, dude? So, another interesting aspect of that is that you've got another complication of irreducible complexity are the sexes themselves. Okay. In reality, in terms of evolution, sexual reproduction doesn't make a whole lot of sense because it requires two organisms to come together. You can reproduce your own gene pool far quickly and more accurately if you're doing it all by yourself. So in reality of gradualism or evolutionism, we should actually be all producing asexually, and there'd be all sorts of pasture kids running around. And one of them would stay at home and watch Duck Dynasty all day while the other worked. So, it's a rather obvious problem, and not only the issue of physical organism to organism contact, but the machinery that allows sexual reproduction to occur itself at the cellular level is outrageously complicated. It's so complicated that it doesn't take much to hose it up. And the issue there, since it didn't take much to hose it up, how did it manage to last this long? And how come we're not overtaken by asexually reproducing organisms? There's actually a very brilliant paper that was written that was what happens if you had a human population and all of a sudden one of the guys was able to reproduce himself. How long would it take him to take over the whole population? And it's actually about 1,000 life cycles. And then basically everybody in the world would be asexually reproducing. So it's an interesting problem that they have zero answers for whatsoever. Matter of fact, I went and looked for one of their answers, okay, and I read this interesting paper called The Origin of Sexual Reproduction. They said in the eukaryotic fossil record, eukaryotes are basically things that have DNA in the nucleus, whereas prokaryotes are outside the nucleus, in case you were just wondering. Sexual reproduction first appeared by 1,200 million years ago in the Proterozoic eon. All sexually reproducing eukaryotic organisms derived from a common ancestor, which was a single-celled species. Many protists reproduce sexually, as do the multicellular plants, animals, and fungi. Sounds like a nice concept. Organisms need to replicate their genetic material in an efficient and reliable manner. The necessity to repair genetic damage is one of the leading theories explaining the origin of sexual reproduction. Diploid individuals can repair a damaged section of their DNA via homologous recombination. Since there are two copies of the gene in a cell and one copy is presumed to be undamaged, a mutation in a haploid individual, on the other hand, is more likely to become resident, as the DNA repair machinery has no way of knowing what the original undamaged sequence was. The most primitive form of sex may have been one organism with damaged DNA replicating an undamaged strand from a similar organism in order to repair itself. Does anybody see anything wrong with this? What? What do you see wrong with it? Yeah, one of the big deals is right here. The necessity to repair genetic damage is one of the leading theories explaining the sign of sexual reproduction, the origin of sexual. That right there should cause you to stop reading anything that these people write, okay? Because what they just said is that by need, evolution occurred, which is by fundamental not part of evolution. All right, that right there throws the whole thing hogwash out the window. Plus, what's interesting is the explanation down here. They just said up here that the organism would have no way of knowing whether or not its DNA was damaged, but down here they have it copying another piece of DNA because it was damaged. They argue against themselves in their own argument. It makes zero sense. And this is what this is the problem with college kids, and it was a problem that I was susceptible to at the time. In college, you read this and you go, okay, that makes sense, we're done, we move on. Whereas in reality, and what's odd is one of the first things they teach you in science is how to read without believing, okay? You're taught that every single paper you read, you're taught to read critically. You look for the problems. You try to figure out why it doesn't work. Any laboratory output or anything, you're taught to understand what they did wrong and find that first, except for when it comes to the origin of the universe. Evidently, that is a no man's land that we're supposed to turn off on. So that's how they go from there. What's interesting aspect of that is actually almost all living organisms today have a refined genetic engine that is specifically designed to reduce and eliminate mutations. Okay, this means that almost all life, especially higher order life forms, have a very specific dedicated system for the sole purpose of reducing and eliminating the exact type of mutations necessary for evolution to occur. Okay, we specifically have machinery that keeps evolution from happening. Yet that must have evolved, which, wow. Okay, we need a 10-year-old going, what? Okay, it's a big deal. Oh yeah, isn't he cute? Yeah. Yeah. I look for, because I'm a dog guy, I look for dog ones, and the dog ones just don't work the same. They're just not near as good. So, how do they try to sneak around this with complex complication? Okay, that is a play on words that I really like. The response that they use is called quantum evolution. Okay, which basically means that comparatively rapid transition from one stable type of biological adaptation to another, distinctly different type under the influence of some strong selective pressure. So what this means is that an animal was on a cliff, and he lived on the edge of the cliff, and he thought it'd be really nice that he could see the edge of the cliff so he didn't fall off. Due to that strong selective pressure, he developed an eyeball instantly, okay, and was able to use it, and that's quantum evolution, okay. I have one response to that, and that's Rambo kidding. This is my favorite of all time. I actually have this on my desktop, and I just stare at it. And, I think he's hilarious. So, now, let's talk about it this way. Does similarity of design and common genetic code mean a common ancestor? Okay, so here we have a dog. Okay, a dog's eye versus a human's eye. It looks about the same, doesn't it? Okay, let's take a look at a dog's ear. Okay, so it's got the occipitals and everything down here, the auditory tube and everything. We basically have exactly the same bone structure here, okay, and the same processing system and everything. And even this middle ear cavity is down here in humans. Anatomically, it's almost exactly the same. The issue, though, is that does that mean that they have a common ancestor? Okay, or does it not mean that they have a common designer? Okay. When we build a new engine, we don't completely scrap the old one and try to invent a whole new way to do it. Okay, we take that old engine and then improve upon it. Okay, there's no reason to force the Lord to rebuild different ways to do absolutely everything for every single organism. Okay, I would assume on some level that he basically came up with ways to do stuff, and he built systems for doing that, and he compiled all those systems together to make each organism. Okay? You don't have to reinvent the wheel to make a car, which is what they're asking you to do when you believe that this and that were due to distinct evolution from a common ancestor. Now, a few more of the problems. Evolutionists like to say, well, of course we cannot see evolution at work because it takes millions of years. This was a statement that was in that video we watched, okay? Consider this. This is actually one of my own arguments. I would like to see produced and stuff, but I can't get some people to take it up. Evolutionists estimate that it takes about 18 million years to evolve from chimps to humans. Okay, so chimps to humans, 18 million years. The average female chimp in the wild reaches reproductive maturity around the age of 14, basically the same as humans. Okay, that's about 1,285,714 generation cycles. Okay. So they're implying that it took about 1.25 million generation cycles to achieve the evolution from a chimp to a basic human. Okay, that's what they're saying. Does anybody know what this is? Cheetos. If this was in your Cheetos, it'd be a very bad day. Okay. This is bacteria, yep. It's Escherichia coli. Okay, one of the fastest reproducing organisms on the face of the planet. What I like to think of is this. The reproductive cycle of E. coli is 17 minutes. Okay, that means it reproduces itself every 17 minutes. It's fast, okay? Scientists have been actively culturing and observing E. coli for about 70 years now, okay? So in the laboratory, actively looking at it. That's about 2,164,235 generation cycles, okay? But evolution estimated it only took 1.25 million cycles to get from chimps to humans. So we've been witness to 60% more generations of E. coli, and yet we haven't seen them evolve into anything, okay? So the idea that we haven't been around long enough to watch evolution is total bovine scatology, okay? It does not work. The difference that have developed, you'll get that at home, okay? The differences that have developed are because we have selectively cultivated different strains, which would be the application of an intelligent design upon the organism, and not the product of a blind natural process, okay? So that's actually all I have on that. We have to remember that basically all scientists are starting off with a false pretense. In the end, it's not really a debate over the evidence itself, because the evidence doesn't really say anything. It's just evidence. The debate is over the philosophy of interpreting that evidence, okay? They consider two causes. They have two types. One would be an intelligent cause. One would be a non-intelligent cause. The problem that they run into is that they immediately discount the intelligent cause. So when they start with there's no intelligent cause and they look at their data, they have to figure out some sort of non-intelligent natural process to make it work, okay? And there lies the rub. They have to find a non-intelligent cause, and the pun there is intended. No matter how far unlikely and or complicated they seem to have to go to explain their evidence. We are not only open to natural causes as Christians, which would be the explanation, but also we can look at the evidence and say that it would appear by the evidence that there are characteristics of an intelligent being involved in this process, okay? And we allow for that. Inherently, it's a philosophy that is a greater level of understanding in terms of options than the ones that they're using. And that's the significant factor. That you got to remember that science doesn't say anything, only scientists do. So that's all I have. Any questions? We're going to think about it. You can email me, whatever you need to do. We'll talk about it.
When scientists are trying to date systems, they all want something to it. You just shown the carbon dating isn't what it's supposed to be. Not everything is going to go back to the
Mm-hmm.
So anything that they're quoting beyond that, you know, it's not that it had been taken down.
Basically, yeah. If they tell you that by carbon dating this thing was 1.27 billion years old, they're full of it. They can't even get that far back. Yeah, it's literally not possible to count it. Now, there are other systems. It all falls prey to the same types of problems. If you take that same system and apply it to lead salt production, and there's one that uses argon, and argon dating can go back quite a bit because of its half-life is much longer. But the problem with argon is that it actively leaves an organism all the time. It's not trapped. But they still use it to date stuff like it is. So, you know. Anything else? Yes. That oldest tree, actually we don't know the exact location. It's in California. They won't tell us because they're afraid people will mess with it.
In California.
Yeah.
And how old was it?
That one is, what, 4,850-ish years?
So if you go by biblical dating, that's around the time that
Yeah, right around the time at the end of the flood, you know. And it's actually on a mountain.
so the oldest thing we can find is on the top of the mountain, and it dates back to when
No.
my father lived.
Yes, yes, yes. It's very interesting. And what's interesting to me is that, you know, the science is inherently in search of in search of answers to the questions. Yet they automatically eliminate half the answers, and they just say that's not possible, which doesn't make any sense at all. And even in terms of just sheer logic, which science is supposed to be fundamentally based on logic, it doesn't make any sense. Occam's razor tells us that evolution is hogwash. because it requires literally billions of things to happen, whereas creationism requires one. So it's really not a very good crutch to stand on. So, anything else? Well, here's the thing. You got to remember that you're listening to a group of people that can't figure out who killed JFK. Okay? And we were here and we have it on video. Okay? And they still can't tell you who killed it. Okay? Or how many people were involved. Okay? Yet they're going to tell you how the organism that created the gun evolved on the face of the planet. The organism that created the car, where the steel came from, and all that stuff, but they can't tell you who pulled the trigger. So it really has to come down to a level of belief in who you're talking to start with. So, anyways, that's all I've got. If you have anything, just let me know, and we'll talk about it then. Let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you for just bringing us together, Lord, and for this time that you've given us just to be witness to this, Lord. And thank you for the words that you've spoken here. And just let it serve your people, Lord. And let them use this to go out and fight what is possibly the greatest evil against you, Lord. And that is this notion of evolution and how it just is used constantly to discount your existence, Lord. And I would just ask that you provide us with not only the will and the knowledge to fight that, Lord, but the opportunity. Just bring people into our lives that we can use this every day, Lord, to show them your way. And Lord, if you just bless us with that, Lord, we just promise to be good stewards of that opportunity, Lord, and to take advantage. And with faith, we just believe in you and everything that we have. In the name of our Holy Son, Jesus Christ, as people said.
Amen. Next week, back in